Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome back to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. I am happy to have you here once more to talk about philosophy, to talk about everything. Today is October the 9th, 2023. This is podcast number 78. I couldn't say it any other way. I wouldn't have it any other way. Being here with you, having the time of my life, talking to you, even though this podcast ain't going nowhere. But I don't know why I do it, but I enjoy talking to you. I enjoy sharing my thoughts and ideas with you. We are going to have a wonderful podcast today. The topic today is still hate, but I am going to take a much more philosophical approach. Still, I am the subject of this season. So I think this is one of the last episodes, because I have one more episode coming up next week, and that's going to be it for this season, and I'll retire for a few months, and I'll head back sometimes perhaps in November or even in December or even in January next year. But in any case, this is it. I'm going to be talking about hate from the perspective of an identity. And the idea is, when you lack an identity, you do not have a sense of self, and you are vulnerable to hatred. You are vulnerable to any sort of negative, toxic environment. And unfortunately, this has been my reality. If you like this podcast, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you're watching us on YouTube, do the same and share this podcast if you have the opportunity. So without further ado, let us delve right into it. Here's a question. How do you exist in this world without an identity? Now, this is a very interesting question, to the extent that I don't know how to answer it. If anybody could help me answer that question, I would be very grateful to that person, because this is my biggest blind spot in this world. Well, let's speculate a little bit about what it means to have an identity. Now, a disclaimer before we move forward here. When I speak of identity, I am not talking about anything other than a philosophical understanding of the human being, okay? In terms of who you are, in terms of your existence in the place of things, or in the large scheme of things, or in the great scheme of things, right? So that's basically what I'm talking about here. The great scheme of things in terms of who you are, where you place yourself. So that's what I am talking about. So please don't take the word identity from a different perspective. That is not my intent here. Now, when I am talking about identity, when I am talking about identity in terms of human existence, what I am talking about the essentiality of the person. And it doesn't matter who you are in terms of how you see yourself, how you identify yourself to be, or how you would like others to see you as. What I am talking about who you are at the most spiritual level, at the most intrinsic sense or level. So the question becomes, well, how do you exist without that sense of being? Being in the world is not set in stone. there's no universal way of saying I am. The concept of I exist, or I cogit, or cogito ergo philoso ergo sum, as René Descartes would say it is not the essentiality of being in the world. There are other facets of being that are much more intrinsic than a self-acclamation or a self-proclamation as to who one is, and to who I am, or who I think I am, or who I want others to think I am. There's something intrinsic, there's something inherent in you that is the essence of your beingness, that gives you a sense of self. It's with that essentiality that you're able to see yourself as. So you will not, or you would not be able to see yourself as, but for that intrinsic sense of self. And when I talk about identity, this is precisely what I'm talking about. Identity, not necessarily at the molecular level or at the biological level, rather identity at the intrinsic level, at the fundamental, at the psychological, or perhaps at the spiritual level. Who are you? Now, this question is hard to answer because there are a series of things that happened, that must happen in a person's life, that would give that person that sense of self. It usually starts at a young age. It starts at what we call the blank slate, where ever since you became conscious of your existence, conscious of yourself around other things, ever since you realize that, wait a minute, that person whom, in the case of a baby, whom is taking care of me is not actually me, it's somebody else, right? Oh, that place that I'm laying on is actually something different. It's a sheet. It's a, it's a crib. It's something that I'm not in space or some. I am in an actual physical reality where I have an actual body. I have needs. I have urges. I have things that I cannot be without. I need food. I need, breast milk and whatnot. I need to exist, and I need to sleep. You become aware of those things as a person, as an entity. Those are parts of what builds you, what makes you, right? But those also gives you a sense of self. And that sense of self over time is reinforced by that environment where you are, right? If you were to be born, and I'm going to be a bit fictitious here. Let us say you were born in a Marrakesh or in sort of a swamp, right? And as you evolve in this environment, everything that surrounds you are swamp-like creatures, right? Swamp-like entities. And at some point, you're going to realize that I am one of them. Now, it doesn't matter who you are in terms of your shape, your skin color and whatnot. There's going to be an intrinsic sense of self in relation to that environment, because you're able to differentiate yourself from that environment based on who you feel yourself are in terms of who you really are intrinsically, right? So when we're talking about identity, we're talking about your past. We're talking about where you've been. We're talking about where you are. And we're also talking about where you're going. Because all of these instances are going to shape your persona, are going to shape who you are, at least in relation to others. How you perceive yourself in relation to others. Not necessarily how you would like to be perceived, but how intrinsically you are deep inside. Okay? And to me, it is essential that every being evolves in an environment where that individual feels safe. And by that I mean you are able to immerse yourself into that environment, where you and the environment are able to merge, where you become the environment as the environment becomes you. And this is usually manifested in people in terms of how they perceive themselves with a particular entity. Let us say a country, right? You were born in a particular place. You were born in a particular town. you were born in a particular country, and you identify with what the reality of that place, the reality of that town, of that country, and somehow you become that country and you see yourself as that country. For example, you call yourself an American because you were born in America, or you were born in an environment that is American-like, and you see yourself as America, as an American, right? And it becomes your intrinsic sense of self. And no matter how you perceive yourself in relation to others, you're going to see that intrinsic self, that American self. And this is usually visible to the extent that you speak a language, to the extent that you have a specific tonality in terms of a specific physical shape, a specific physical whereabouts, a specific physical, sort of trademark, right? The language usually is the most vivid, sense of who you are, your identity. For example, if you're born in Canada, you're gonna have something about you that identify you as Canadian, right? And anybody who is a Canadian is gonna be able to look at you and say, oh, you and I were the same, because we have something about us that we can identify. We can see ourselves together in that particular milieu. And like I say, it's usually the language, usually the gastronomy, it's the culture, it's the beingness in this environment that sort of gives you that identity, right? And as you go older, that identity is reinforced, enforced, and somewhat, even though you were to leave this country, you would still go back to your place of origins, because that's what gives you the essence of who you are, right? So, and that is why it is somewhat difficult. It's been difficult for me to sort of know who I am, And the biggest struggle that I have had in my life is to identify myself. You see, I'm not going to branch out a little bit from philosophy, a little bit of being a bit anecdotal, right? I was born in a country where, ever since I was a child, my identity has been put into question. My mother always reminded me that, the day I was born, my father didn't think that I was his. Contrary to now, where you somewhat have a sense of who the baby is going to be in terms of sex and whatnot, back then it was quite difficult to know those things. It's like the birthday, the day the baby was born, was a surprise. It's like, oh, the baby's here. Everybody wants to go see the baby and somewhat. Me, when I came into this world, my father looked at me, thought that I was not who he expected, what he expected, and immediately rejected me. Okay? He immediately rejected me. And it was quite a difficult childhood for me, because my mother struggled with me. My father was never a part of my life. I was never a part of his. And he rejected me, and it's a rejection that over time, as I became more aware of my environment, more aware of myself, that rejection started to take a toll on me, because I realized that I was not welcome here. And that society, that environment, that little family, my mother was struggling to make me fit in, and my father was doing everything to make me feel unwelcome. So I grew up being loved on one side by mother and being loathed on the other side by my father. And to this day, I don't know why, other than the fact that he didn't think I was his child. He didn't think I belonged to him. And this would unfold to a point where he and my mom would be separated in a very nasty way. And he would vow, my father would vow to exterminate me, which he tried to do on a few occasions. Okay, of course with voodoo and whatnot, he tried. And I've watched this, and I grew up in the country where, ever since I was a child, and my mother kept reminding me, people are gonna hate your guts. People are gonna hate your guts. And aside from what my history with my dad, everybody else around me, at least most people, I could sense their resentment. I can feel their hatred. I could feel their disgust. even those who were supposedly my friends, at some point, something about me didn't sit well with them, and they didn't hesitate to make me feel unwelcome in their lives. So I focused on me. I dedicated myself to me, and I loved myself. And I invested everything I got in myself. I educated myself. I strengthened my brain. And, I became more despised, right? So when I reached my youth, what we call my teenage years, and, again, I've witnessed several things in my life. I have been lynched 3 times in my life. I have been robbed at gunpoint. I have been beaten. I've watched my mother being beaten by other people. I've watched my grandmother being beaten. And some guy in the neighborhood beat my grandmother in front of me and broke 7 of her ribs. She limped until the day she died. And I was the only male in the family, by the way. So I've watched people. So as I grew older, I kept wondering, do I belong in this community? Do I belong in this society, in this place that I was born into? Am I one of them? And this has been a huge question because I, as a young man, I've always seen the world differently. And that's one of the reasons why I was not liked. Because I've always called out things that most people thought were normal. And I'm like, no. This is not normal. You're not supposed to treat people like that. You're not supposed to act like this. You're not supposed to talk like that. You're not supposed. That's who I was. That's why I grew up. That's how I grew up. And people despised me for it. And the more they despised me, the more I questioned myself. Who am I? Where do I belong? Why do I see the world differently from everybody else? Why am I the only one who doesn't agree when everybody else thinks it's okay to do that? Why? And those questions baffled me my whole life. So when I left home and ended up in Mexico, and the same thing, I arrived in Mexico, and all of a sudden, I realized that I was different from Mexicans. Now, I didn't know I was black until I got to Mexico. Then all of a sudden, I realized, wait a minute, I am black. I didn't know I was black, because where I grew up, everybody's black. Being black didn't make a difference. I thought I had other differences with these people, but my skin color was not one of them. But when I got to Mexico, aside from being different in so many levels, I found out that I was also different because my skin color was different. The way I speak was different. My accent was different. My understanding, and people were curious about me, but others were quite taken by my logic, by my professorial attitude. I've always tried to educate people, even when people didn't like it. And that's something I've always done my whole life. So all of these brought me to question my identity. Because now the place I was born, I could not identify with it. I couldn't identify with the people around me, the people that I grew up. I could not identify with them. And after I left home, my mother died a couple of years later. And I had nothing left home because my mother was everything I got. And when she died, then I felt like I was alone in this world. Yes, I had a few siblings, but they were not really me. We were different, right? So when my mother passed, I had nobody to talk to. No one could understand what I was going through. And it was the biggest loss of my life. And to this day, I still cry about my mother's death. I still cry about it. But I couldn't find out who I am. I couldn't fit in. So when I left Mexico and came to America, and the cycle continued. Like I was different. Now I was hated for being different. Yes, here in America, I was also a black man, but unlike Mexico, it was frowned upon. In Mexico, people were curious about me being black. In America, people just didn't like me being black. Now I had to hide who I am. Not only am I hiding where I am from, I'm hiding my country of origin. I am hiding my skin color, my accent. I am trying everything not to sound like my people. I'm trying everything not to be like them, because I found out being one of the people that came from the place that I came from is not welcome in America. Yes, a few people where I come from succeed in America, but for the most part, brother, it's hard being from this place. You're despised, and my last name, which was a symbol of my identity, was a no. So I had to change that. I had to change every facet of my being. And the people at home, even those who live here in the States, they still hate me, brother. They still hate me. Sometimes I stare into the dark, and I try to figure out why or who I am, why I'm here, what am I doing here. And this existential question, I ask myself that question all the time, and I have not found the answer. My identity. What was supposed to give me identity? I don't have it. I can't tell the world that I'm from this place, because deep inside, I'm not. Where I grew up, where I learned to walk, where I learned to talk, where I learned to run, where I became a person. I can't tell the world I'm from this place, because on one hand, the world doesn't like these people. On the other hand, these people don't like me. Then who I am, brother? And that's why I cannot answer this question. I don't have an identity. And I vacillate in this world, trying to find out who I am. And it's a painful moment. And rejection, I don't have to talk about it. Don't get me started. That's all I've known. That's all I have known. And sometimes I look back, I'm like, well, why do these people hate me so much? And I wonder, why was I born the way I was born? Why I am who I am? And to this day, I don't have the answer. But if you do, reach out. Please do. I would greatly appreciate it. I would greatly appreciate it.